echoes of the fallen. The war had left a scar on my soul, deeper than anything I thought capable of healing. What followed after the final gunshot, the last explosion, was not peace. It was an endless echo of those lost, of men I had fought beside and against, men who should still be here today. But the world we lived in after those years was darker, heavier, filled with ghosts that no one saw but us. I remember the first battle like it was yesterday. It was the kind of chaos you could never imagine until you're thrust into the middle of it. And even then, you don't fully understand what you're living through until you've walked away from it, forever changed. The guns, the yelling, the blinding flashes of fire, they all blur together in one massive, crushing wave. But the thing that stands out, the thing that haunts me still, are the faces of the men I couldn't save. I think about them all the time, not just in my dreams, but when I'm awake too. I think about how their names never made it onto the headlines or into the history books. Their stories died with them, forgotten by all but those who were there. I try to imagine what it would have been like if we'd lived in a world without war. I guess I was naive back then, even for a soldier. I believed in the cause, in the fight for something bigger. But all those ideals melted away the first time I saw the cost. One of the first men I lost was Corporal Harris. He was a big guy, all broad shoulders and a deep laugh that could fill any room. He had a way of making you feel like everything was going to be all right, even when things were falling apart. I still hear his voice sometimes, even though I know he's gone. The night we lost him, we were pinned down by enemy fire, and every second felt like an eternity. Harris was there, urging us on, telling us to push forward, no matter how many of us fell. He never flinched, not once. Even when the bullets were so close, you could feel the wind they cut through. But then he was gone. It didn't even make sense at first. One minute he was shouting orders, the next he was lying there, blood staining the earth he had tried so hard to defend. I still remember the way his eyes looked wide open in surprise, like he was trying to figure out why this was happening. Why him? I don't know why he was taken, why it wasn't me. I wasn't brave enough to die that day. But I couldn't save him. And that's the part I'll never be able to shake. The months that followed were a blur of fire, fear, and pain. I don't know how we kept going. Maybe it was just instinct, the drive to survive. There was nothing else. No time to mourn, no time to question. You did what you had to do to keep going. But then the whispers started. At first, it was just the sounds of the wind, the rustling of leaves. But as we moved deeper into enemy territory, it grew stronger. The soldiers around me began to act strange. It was like they could hear something I couldn't. They'd stop mid-step, their eyes darting around as if they were being watched. And I suppose they were, in a way. But what really got to me was the letter. The first one came when we were stationed in a small town, just a few miles behind the front lines. A young soldier, Private Miller, found it in a shack, the paper yellowed and frayed. He couldn't read the language, but the message was clear enough. There was something out there waiting. Something we couldn't escape, no matter how far we ran. The letter spoke of an ancient curse, a force that had been awakened with the war. It wasn't just the enemy that was hunting us. There were other things in those woods, things that had waited for centuries, and now they were coming for us. I'll admit, I didn't believe it at first. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, and we began to see things, shadows in the corners of our vision, flickers of movement that vanished when we turned our heads. The first time I saw one of them, I thought I was dreaming. It was standing just outside the camp, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. I couldn't make out its face, just the outline of its form, tall and thin, like a man, but not a man. It moved, but not like a man. It was a shifting thing, like the wind, its body bending in unnatural ways. When it saw me staring, it vanished. I couldn't sleep after that. None of us could. We'd sit in our tents, staring at the walls, trying to ignore the sounds that drifted from the woods. We'd hear footsteps, the rustling of branches, but every time we checked, there was nothing there. That's when it started happening. The soldiers began to disappear. It wasn't in the heat of battle, but in the dead of night. One minute they were there, and the next, gone. No signs of struggle, no blood. It was as if they had simply been erased. The whispers were growing louder now, and the soldiers who remained were becoming more and more paranoid. No one trusted anyone else. We started seeing faces in the shadows, our fallen comrades, their eyes empty and staring. It was like they were still there, haunting us. I started writing my own letters. At first, I wrote to my family, telling them I was okay, that I would be home soon. But it wasn't true. Nothing about this was okay. The war had taken more from me than I could ever explain, and it was still taking. Each letter I wrote felt like a lie, a message to reassure the people I loved that I was still me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. None of us were. By the time we reached the final stretch of the war, everything had become a blur. The lines between reality and nightmare began to fade. I couldn't tell you if the things we saw were real or just the result of too many nights without sleep, too many battles where we fought not just for survival, but against the creeping madness that threatened to consume us all. And then the war ended. We won. Or at least, that's what they told us. But the victory felt hollow. The soldiers who came back, myself included, were never the same. We'd seen too much, done too much, and the ghosts followed us home. I don't talk about it much. Who would understand? How do you explain to someone what it's like to carry the weight of the dead, to walk among the living, and feel the eyes of the fallen on your back? The war never really ended for me. It still whispers in the dark corners of my mind, and I'm not sure I'll ever escape it. But I do know one thing: the dead are never truly gone. They're with us always, in the memories, in the shadows. And maybe that's the price of war, that even when it's over, it never really ends. The war never truly ends, you see. I used to think it was just something we said to keep from facing the truth. But there's no escaping it. Not for us. Not for anyone who's seen what I've seen, heard what I've heard. I don't remember when the whispers first began, but they never stopped. Not even after the fighting ended, after the blood stopped spilling, after the world celebrated a victory we never truly felt. I try to go on with life. I work, I keep busy, I pretend to be normal. I even laugh sometimes, though it doesn't sound the same. There's a hollow ring to it now, like it's coming from somewhere far off, like it belongs to someone else. Some nights, I still dream of the battlefield. Not of the fights, but of the faces of the men who never made it out. Sometimes it's just a flash, a quick glimpse of them in the smoke, their eyes wide with confusion or pain. But there are nights when they're right there with me, standing beside me in the dark, their voices low and pleading, telling me things I don't want to hear. One of the worst nights I had was a few weeks after the war officially ended. I came back home to my family, to the life I thought I could return to, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. There were moments when I could almost trick myself into believing I was the same person, but then I'd hear something. Just a whisper, a rustle of fabric, a voice I thought I recognized, and I'd snap back to that place, that awful place where nothing was ever safe. That night, I took a walk. I don't know why, but something called to me. Maybe it was the need to escape. Maybe it was the terror that I would go crazy if I stayed still for too long. I walked until I found myself in the woods near the old farm where I grew up. It was quiet there, almost too quiet. I could hear my own breath, the crunch of leaves underfoot, but there was something else too, just beyond the edge of hearing. It was like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then I saw them. At first, it was just a movement at the corner of my eye, a shadow. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe I was just tired. But the whispers were growing louder now, calling my name in that way that only the dead can do. I tried to ignore it to walk faster, but the forest seemed to close in on me, the trees pressing together like they were trying to keep me in. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell myself it was just my mind, that it was the war still crawling around inside my head. But then I saw them again. This time, there were 3 of them, standing in a clearing up ahead. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. But they were coming closer, their forms shifting, like they weren't quite solid. As they drew nearer, I could see their faces. Men I had fought beside, men I had lost. Corporal Harris was there, his broad shoulders, his deep laugh replaced now with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Private Miller, his nervous energy gone, replaced with something darker, something that seemed to understand what I couldn't. And then there was Lieutenant Turner, whose face was barely recognizable, so badly scarred from the blast that it looked like something from a nightmare. They stood there, watching me, but not really seeing me. They didn't need to. It wasn't me they were looking at. They were looking through me, through everything, to the thing that lay underneath, to the thing we all became in the end. And then they spoke, but it wasn't in words. It was more like a feeling, a pressure in my chest, a gnawing, hollow sensation in the pit of my stomach. I heard their voices in my head, clear and cold, as though they were right next to me. You don't belong here anymore. You're not one of us. You can't outrun this. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the ghosts of men I had once called brothers. All I knew was that I couldn't leave them. Not yet. Not until I understood why they were here, what they wanted, why their eyes still followed me even though they were dead. And then, as if in answer, the ground shifted. The trees creaked and groaned, bending unnaturally, as if the very earth itself was alive. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was a presence, an old, hungry thing that had waited for us to come home, for us to bring the war with us. I tried to run then, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the earth had taken hold of me, refusing to let go. The voices grew louder, more insistent, more desperate. I had to understand. I had to know why this was happening. And then I heard it, the sound of distant footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, like someone walking toward me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. But when the footsteps stopped, there was no one there. Just the wind. And the trees. I don't know how long I stood there waiting. But when I finally turned to look, the ghosts were gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving only the silence behind them. I didn't go back home that night. Instead, I sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out why it felt like something was waiting for me, something older than the war, older than time itself. The next day, I started writing again. Letters. To my family, to my comrades, to anyone who would listen. I needed to tell them what had happened, what was still happening. But the words never came. The ghosts never left. I don't know if they ever will. Maybe that's the real war, the one that doesn't end when the fighting stops. The one that stays with you, long after the guns fall silent. The war inside your head. The war between the living and the dead. And I can't help but wonder, when all this is over, will we ever truly be at peace? The memories of those early days still haunted me, flickering like shadows in the corners of my mind. It was as if I could still hear the distant cries, the shouts of the men beside me, some of whom I had come to know so well, others only by the blood on their hands. War had a way of making strangers into brothers, even if only for a moment. The days in that trench had felt endless, stretched out like an eternity. Each minute seemed to crawl by, each hour a reminder of how close we all were to the edge. You could hear the roar of the artillery in the distance, always approaching and always closer than you'd ever expect. We all lived in that rhythm, the roar of the guns, the whispers of the wind, the smell of dirt and blood clinging to the air. It's strange, but it wasn't the fear of death that held me down. It was the helplessness, the sheer weight of it all, knowing there were things happening around me that no one could control, not even the soldiers. I remember a man, Corporal Danvers. He was the kind of man who seemed immune to fear. He joked and laughed at the worst of times, trying to lighten the mood. But I could see it in his eyes, the same look I had, the understanding that we were all inching toward a place from which there would be no return. One night, I overheard him telling one of the others, "Sometimes, I think the earth is going to swallow us all. That's how deep we're sinking in this madness." It was hard to argue with him. The more we fought, the more we seemed to lose of ourselves. My hands, once steady, now trembled whenever I picked up my rifle. Not because I feared the gun, but because I had begun to lose the line between man and monster. In that pit, all of us at times were capable of becoming something else, something darker. And then there was that night, one I will never forget. It was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I was on watch, my breath hanging in the frigid air. The forest ahead was still, too still. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I kept hearing something, a sound in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual sound of the wind or the trees swaying. It was something else. A crackling noise like fire, but too rhythmic, too deliberate. I remember Danvers walking over to me, his shadow falling across my line of sight. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me. We both heard it. The whispering. It was so faint, so far away, yet it felt like the forest was alive, breathing, watching. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. We both looked at each other, unsure of what to do. But there was something in Danvers' eyes, a look of recognition, as if he had been expecting it all along. "You heard it too?" I asked him. He nodded. "It's the dead. They follow us, you know. They always do." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I felt it. The weight of it. The shadows around us were moving, almost alive with some unspeakable presence. But what could we do? We were just soldiers. We were all just trying to survive. The next morning, Danvers was gone. There was no trace of him, just his gear left behind in the trench. I searched for him. There was no blood, no signs of struggle. He had vanished. It's hard to explain what happened. I can't say for sure that it was anything supernatural, but I know this much: whatever happened to him that night, it wasn't of this world. The war, it seemed, had no mercy for anyone. Every moment felt like an eternity, and the men around me, my brothers in arms, slowly faded into something else. Some broke, some fell silent, and some, like Danvers, just disappeared without explanation. It was the silence after those moments that haunted me most. You'd expect something, a scream, a shout, but there was nothing. Just a void where there used to be life. The days blurred together. Time was a construct that had no meaning anymore. We lived moment to moment, never knowing if the next one would be our last. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when everything would pause. I remember one of those moments clearly. It was late afternoon, the light was dimming, and I had a brief moment to myself. I was sitting on the edge of the trench, looking out over the landscape, a barren wasteland of mud and burnt trees. The air smelled of sulfur and decay, but for that one moment, there was peace. That's when I saw it, the flicker of movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing games with me, worn thin by exhaustion. But then it moved again, too quick to be a shadow, too deliberate to be the wind. I stood, instinctively reaching for my rifle, but there was no immediate danger. No one else seemed to notice, even though I was sure they must have seen it too. It was a person, or something like one, creeping just beyond the tree line. It wasn't just a figure. It was something that didn't belong there. I couldn't explain it, but I knew deep down that whatever it wasn't human. It was like a presence, something that had been there long before we had arrived. A part of this cursed earth. I tried to ignore it. The war was madness enough without chasing shadows. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, even after I left the trench that day. The days dragged on, each one as grueling as the last. We fought, we bled, and we buried our dead. But no matter how many men we lost, the enemy never seemed to run out. There were always more to fight, to kill, to mourn. I thought about the man who had disappeared, Danvers, and the strange thing he'd said about the dead following us. At the time, I'd brushed it off, but in the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There were times, too many times, when the air felt heavy, as though the earth itself had been soaked with so much blood that it could no longer hold the dead beneath its surface. And sometimes, when the battle had paused, I could hear them. Whispers on the wind, not quite audible, but there. Just enough to send a chill down your spine. I started to see them more clearly, too. Figures in the distance, always just outside of reach. Soldiers, our own I thought at first, but their eyes, they were wrong. Hollow, empty, like they were not entirely alive. They walked with purpose, but there was no emotion in their steps, no humanity in their movement. They were just shadows stuck between the world of the living and the dead. But we kept fighting. We kept moving forward. Because what else could we do? And then came the night we'd been waiting for, the final push. The enemy had retreated, but we had no idea where they'd gone. It was the calm before the storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct. We had to make one last stand, and push into the heart of enemy territory. We moved out at dawn, the sun barely breaking through the thick clouds. The sky was gray, the ground wet with the remnants of rain. The air was thick with smoke, and the scent of gunpowder hung heavy. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath. As we approached the enemy's last known position, I felt it, the same strange presence I'd felt that day in the trench. It was there again, in the air. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. This time, it was everywhere. The earth beneath our feet seemed to tremble, as if something ancient and powerful was waking up. We reached the edge of the woods, where the trees were thick and dark. The whispering grew louder, the air colder. I could see the fear in the faces of the men around me, but we pushed forward. It wasn't the enemy we were afraid of anymore. It was whatever was waiting for us in that cursed forest. As we ventured deeper into the woods, I could hear the sounds of movement around us. Not just the rustling of leaves or the distant cries of birds. No, this was something else, something closer, something following us. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I instinctively reached for my rifle. But it wasn't the enemy I was worried about. We stopped at a clearing, and that's when I saw it. The figure. No, not a figure, more like an apparition. A man, or something that used to be one. He was standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at us. His face was covered in dirt and blood, his uniform torn and ragged. But his eyes, they were the worst part. They were hollow, empty, like he had been dead for years. But I could see him. I could feel him. And I knew, deep down, that he wasn't the only one. The others were all around us, hidden in the trees, just beyond our sight. That's when the first shot rang out. It wasn't from our side. It wasn't even a rifle. It was something far worse, something that made the air itself vibrate with power. The ground beneath us shook, and the sky darkened. And in that moment, I realized whatever we were fighting, it wasn't just soldiers. It was something older. Something that had been there long before we'd ever picked up our guns. And it wasn't going to stop until we were all gone. But we fought anyway. What else could we do? As the chaos unfolded around us, I could see the faces of the men I had fought beside, their eyes wide with fear, their hands trembling as they fired into the shadows. But the shadows didn't move. They didn't retreat. They were everywhere, closing in on us. I don't know how long the battle lasted. Time didn't matter anymore. What mattered was survival. What mattered was getting out alive, even if I didn't know what would be waiting for us on the other side. In the end, we didn't win. We didn't lose either. But we never made it back the same. None of us did. I've thought about that day many times since. And I've come to one conclusion: there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding. Things that are older than war, older than death. And no matter how hard we fight, no matter how many men we lose, those things will always be waiting for us. They'll always be there. And the dead? They never leave. They follow us. Always. As the war continued to drag on, the line between the living and the dead began to blur for me. I wasn't sure what I had expected when I signed up: glory, honor, maybe even a sense of duty. But what I found instead was a landscape of fear, of men twisted by their experiences, of sights I can't describe without feeling my soul tremble. The woods where we had fought were far from the only place where this strange, oppressive energy lingered. It followed us, not just in the forest, but in the camps we set up, in the trenches we dug, and in the quiet hours when the guns finally fell silent. Each time the fighting stopped, we were left with nothing but the echoes of those who had gone before us, their whispers winding their way through the trees like the wind itself. We learned to live with the nightmares, or at least we thought we did. But there was something about that last night, the night the dead seemed to come to life, that stayed with me long after the war ended. When I think back on it now, I often wonder, were they real? Or was it just the war, messing with my mind, leaving me with shadows that I could never shake? It's a question I don't ask too often, because the answer doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. The truth is, I'll never know. I'll never be able to shake the feeling that there was something else out there with us, something that existed beyond the war, beyond the bloodshed, something that was there before we ever fired our first shots, and something that would be there long after we laid down our arms. That night, after we'd lost men and the enemy had retreated, we found ourselves wandering through the ruins. The battlefield was eerily silent, the fog thick, swallowing up everything in its path. It was almost as though the earth itself had been turned inside out, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when we saw it. It wasn't like the other figures we had seen in the woods. No, this was different. This one stood there in the middle of the clearing, watching us with those same hollow eyes. It was as if it had been waiting for us, anticipating our arrival, knowing we would come. And just like that, the whispers started again, this time louder, closer, as if the dead themselves were pushing through the veil, demanding to be heard. There was no escaping it. I remember the feeling of coldness spreading through me as I stood there, staring at that figure, knowing that whatever it wasn't something I could fight with a rifle or a grenade. It wasn't something I could outrun. It was part of the earth, part of the history of this land, a land that had borne witness to countless horrors long before any of us had arrived. We never spoke of it, not aloud, not to anyone else. But we all felt it, the heavy weight of that night, the sensation that the past and the present were colliding in ways we couldn't understand. And even after the war ended, when I went back home, the memory of that figure, of those whispers, stayed with me. They followed me, just like they had followed us through the battlefield. I think of it sometimes when I'm alone, when the world goes quiet. The dead, they never truly leave, do they? They stay with you, in the corners of your mind, in the spaces between your thoughts. And the worst part is, you can't fight them. You can't outrun them. You just have to live with them, because the moment you stop fighting, they take over. They consume you. I don't know if anyone else saw what I saw that night. I don't know if they heard the whispers or felt the chill in the air. But I do know this, whatever it was more than just a ghost, more than just a memory of the dead. It was something ancient, something that had witnessed all of humanity's cruelty, all of our violence, and it had been waiting, watching, and it would keep waiting. Because in the end, the war never really ends. It's always there, lingering in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our understanding. It's a part of us now, a part of the land, a part of the world we've created. And maybe that's the real horror. Not the blood, not the death, not even the ghosts, but the fact that we've become a part of it. As the years passed, the weight of what I had seen, what I had lived through, began to settle more heavily on my heart. The questions, the doubts, the emptiness, they all started to fill the space where hope once lived. For a long time, I couldn't speak about it. How could I? How could anyone understand what it was like standing there in that hell, watching men, good men, strong men, disappear like smoke in the wind? But one day, after the nightmares had begun to blur into a hazy fog, I started thinking differently. It wasn't just the ghosts I feared anymore. It was the silence that followed. The silence that told me the world hadn't changed, that we still hadn't learned. I think back on the way we were back then, the way we justified our actions. It was always for the greater good, wasn't it? Every action, every death, every tear shed was for the cause. We said we were doing it for peace, for a future. But now, as the years pile up and the world keeps spinning, I'm left wondering, did we truly fight for a better world? Or were we simply too blind to see that we were part of the problem all along? The more I think about it, the more I realize that we're never really changes. Sure, the uniforms might be different and the weapons might be more advanced, but at the core, it's the same old story. A handful of men who aren't really any different from you or me, deciding the fate of millions with a single order. And for what? Land, power, revenge? When you step back and look at it, it all seems so pointless. It's funny, I thought I'd feel something different when the war ended. I thought I'd feel relief or maybe joy, but instead it was just this emptiness, this void. Like something inside me had died along with the soldiers who never made it home. I don't talk about it often, but I'll tell you this. The hardest part wasn't the bloodshed or the gunfire. It was what happened when the war ended. It was when we came home, back to our families, back to the world we once knew. That's when the true battle began. You think the hardest thing about surviving a war would be the scars it leaves on your body, but it's the scars on your soul that linger far longer. The things you see, the things you do, they never leave you. They just become a part of who you are, creeping into your thoughts when you least expect it. And the worst part, it feels like you can never escape it. Not in your mind, not in your dreams. But as time passed, I started thinking about the future. What kind of world did I want to leave behind? What kind of world did we, those of us who survived, want to build? We fought so hard for something, but now that the fighting was over, I had to ask myself, what were we really fighting for? It's funny how the memories of the dead begin to fade. At first, it's all you can think about. Their faces, their voices, their cries, everything is so vivid, so real. But over time, it becomes harder to remember them. The faces blur, the voices fade. The memories start to turn into shadows, and all you're left with is the feeling of loss. I couldn't help but think, what if we did something to honor them? Not just in memory, but in action. What if we changed the world? And that's when I realized, maybe that's the real battle. Not fighting wars that we don't understand or winning battles that don't matter, but fighting to change the world for the better. Fighting for peace in a way that actually makes sense. I've seen the aftermath of war, the destruction, the broken families, the lost lives, and I can't help but think that after everything we've been through, we owe it to the future to do better. To be better. You think a man like me would be cynical, right? After all, I've seen more death than I care to admit, and I've buried enough friends to fill 100 graves. But there's something about this whole mess that keeps me going. Something that whispers to me when the nights are long and the pain is deep, maybe we can do better. Maybe the world doesn't have to keep repeating the same mistakes over and over. Maybe, just maybe, there's a way out of all this. I can't go back and change what happened. None of us can. But we can change what happens next. We can choose a different path. We can build a world where we don't have to send our children off to fight battles that aren't theirs to fight. It sounds naive, doesn't it? Maybe it is. But after everything I've seen, after everything I've lost, I've come to realize one thing. As long as there's breath in my lungs, I'll keep fighting. Not with guns or bombs, but with words and actions. I'll fight for a world where peace isn't just something we talk about, but something we live. And I'll fight for the memory of the men who never made it back, for the ones who fought and died without ever knowing why. Because they deserve better. We all deserve better.